My name is Catherine Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome, and thank you for attending tonight's talk. I'd also like to thank our friends at Hubtown Tours for their support of Old North's digital speaker series. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on land that was once the land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, nor should their stories and memories. In 2024, as we draw closer and closer to the 250th anniversary of our nation and the intervening anniversaries of events like our Lantern Signal at Old North, our speaker series is engaging with the idea of revolution. On April 25th, we hope you'll join us for From Queer Puritans to Marriage Equality in the Commonwealth. Historian and author Russ Lopez will discuss how a state that was formed on strong puritanical ideologies became the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. Discussing some of the lesser-known histories of Massachusetts' past, Lopez shows us that there has always been an LGBTQ+ community in the Commonwealth, just not always in plain sight. Also coming up, on May 15th, Professor Crystal Nicole Edens of the University of Pittsburgh will give a talk about the Haitian Revolution, and in particular about the silence of women in that revolution. We will be adding that listing to Eventbrite in the coming days. Tonight, we welcome author Barbara Berenson for a talk about the Woman Suffrage Movement in Massachusetts and about the many ways in which Black activists and working class organizers fought for suffrage, even as many white leaders ignored their efforts. Barbara Berenson is the author of Massachusetts and the Women's Suffrage Movement, Revolutionary Reformers, Boston in the Civil War, Hub of the Second Revolution, and Walking Tours of Civil War Boston, Hub of Abolitionism. Barbara earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard College and her law degree from Harvard Law School. She worked as a senior attorney at the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court until June 2019. She has taught classes on women's suffrage at Tufts University, and she currently teaches at Harvard Law School and Northeastern University. Barbara serves on the boards of Boston by Foot and the Royal House and Slave Quarters. So, with that, I'll remind you to mute your microphones, put your questions in the chat, and enjoy tonight's program. Barbara, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that kind introduction. Thank you so much to all of you at Old North and at Hubtown Tours for sponsoring this wonderful series. As you heard from the mention of my work with Boston by Foot and the Royal House and Slave Quarters, I have a passionate commitment to historical sites in Boston. So I am delighted to be here. I am now just going to do the most challenging part of the evening for me, which is sharing my screen and make sure it works perfectly. And I've got to now just drag it over, and then I will make sure that I get told, let me make it larger. Whoops, that's too big.
That looks good.
Looks good. Okay, then we are good to go. So, whoops, why did that not, I guess I'll just accept. The only problem is my screen did not advance. Hold on, we'll figure it out. I'm so sorry. For a wholly unknown reason, the PowerPoint did not advance. So let me just figure out what could have possibly happened. I'm so sorry. And I will start in 1 second, I promise. Because worst case, we will do it a different way. Let me just screen share it again. Are you seeing it?
Not yet.
No, all right.
There it is.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, I may have to look over here, but as long as you can see the pictures, that's what matters. So what I'm going to do is explain to you first why I wrote this book. And then the women's suffrage story is a long, complicated story. It took place over nearly a century. And we're certainly not going to be able to cover all of it tonight by any means. But what I'm going to try to do is focus on certain highlights and explain why I've chosen those particular highlights to focus on. So the goals of the book when I decided to write it was to really uncover the Massachusetts story, because the Massachusetts story, as you'll hear, was not only a story about one state, a very important state, but just one state, but it really was a story about major leaders in the movement. And it raises the issue of, why don't we know that? Why does everybody know about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, but so many fewer people, for example, know about Lucy Stone and Maude Wood Park and so many other women from Massachusetts? So I wanted to explore why history is told the way it is and focus on telling what I thought was a more complete story of the suffrage movement by focusing on some of this history that had not before been told. So that's what we're going to go through tonight. And we're going to look at various pieces of this story. What we're going to do tonight is highlight several key episodes and think about the lessons we have learned that could be relevant today, as well as to understanding the past. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about when the women's suffrage movement began. If we were all together in person, I would probably ask you for a show of hands or to answer the question of when did the women's rights movement begin? And I suspect that almost everybody would raise their hand and suggest 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, which we'll talk about in a moment. But of course, the Seneca Falls Convention didn't just spring out of nowhere. It's not as if Elizabeth Cady Stanton woke up one morning and said, "What shall I do this hot July day? I know, let's have a convention to discuss women's rights." Many things had to have happened first. And I argue in my book that what happened before was largely based here in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts, as probably everyone here tonight knows, was a center of the nation's abolitionist or anti-slavery movement. There were, of course, so we're now turning back to the 1830s. There were, of course, a number of opponents of slavery throughout this nation's history, going back to the American Revolution and its aftermath. But by the 1830s, there were a number of abolitionists who were convinced that slavery was a terrible thing, a moral affront to the country, and needed to be eradicated. And one of the most famous abolitionists in this country was William Lloyd Garrison of Massachusetts. And one of the things that William Lloyd Garrison did is he established a newspaper called The Liberator, which was dedicated to the total eradication of slavery from the United States. I'm sure many of you here tonight know that Garrison spoke at the Park Street Church. He set up the offices of The Liberator in a building that no longer survives, but right in Government Center. And Garrison was a true radical because not only was he out to end slavery in an era when very few people believed that slavery should come to an end. Remember, this is the 1830s. But he also welcomed African Americans and women to join him in this anti-slavery movement. And so some of Garrison's earliest allies were very important women. Maria Stewart, an African-American woman of whom sadly there is no surviving image, who worked with Garrison on The Liberator for several years before she was met with such criticism that she ended up moving away from Massachusetts, but a very important figure. Maria Weston Chapman, a privileged white woman, also worked with Garrison on the Liberator newspaper, but she also began to form what were called female anti-slavery societies. Garrison was an organizer as well as a writer and publisher, and he helped to form anti-slavery societies. And Maria Weston Chapman sought to do the same thing for women, hoping that women would be persuaded to sign anti-slavery petitions that would ultimately be submitted to Congress, because petitioning was the one political activity open to women of that era, since, of course, they could not vote and had no other political rights. At the time when people like Maria Stewart and Chapman and several other women became involved with William Lloyd Garrison, this cartoon demonstrates what most people thought the sphere of woman should be. This is obviously a middle-class view of woman. Everybody looks well-nourished. The little girl is, of course, literate. It's not that women wouldn't be trained to read and write and so forth, but they were being trained for their role as wives and mothers of the Republic, so they could nurture the husbands and sons who would do the important work of building the nation. So to be involved in advocating any kind of women's involvement in the public sphere was a departure from the notion that the home is where women belonged. The next major milestone, as we go rapidly through this very interesting story, is in 1837, when William Lloyd Garrison sought out Angelina and Sarah Grimke to join him in the anti-slavery movement. The 1830s, there were still very few witnesses to Southern slavery involved in the anti-slavery movement. This is years before people like Frederick Douglass and others had self-emancipated themselves and joined in the movement. And Angelina and Sarah Grimke were wealthy daughters of a planter who also had a city house where they grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. And Sarah, the older sister, had traveled to Philadelphia with her father, who sought medical treatment there. And while there, she had been persuaded by Quakers, many of whom were anti-slavery, as you may know. Quakers believed that it was immoral for another person to own another person. And Sarah Grimke had been persuaded of the evils of slavery. She returned to Charleston with her father. Later on, after her father died in the early 1830s, she and her younger sister, Angelina, moved to Philadelphia and joined one of these female anti-slavery societies, one actually led by Lucretia Mott. And they there read the Liberator newspaper. And Angelina Grimke one day picked up her pen and wrote a letter to William Lloyd Garrison, praising the important work he was doing and saying, this is a cause worth dying for. Garrison understood how wonderful it would be if he could recruit these two wealthy daughters of the South to speak out against the evils of slavery they had witnessed. And he invited them to come and be trained as anti-slavery lecturers. Men were being trained as anti-slavery lecturers, and now we suggested that Angelina and Sarah also be trained. They did so, and in the summer of 1837, with the help of Maria Weston Chapman, who organized the tour, they embarked on a speaking tour throughout many Massachusetts towns to talk about the evils of slavery. It was anticipated, as radical a notion as it was, that Angelina and Sarah would go out and speak about a political issue. Everybody imagined that they would speak only to groups of women. But what happened was Angelina did most of the speaking. She was apparently a wonderful speaker. And as reports of her speaking traveled around, more and more people wanted to come hear her, including men. Her talks grew bigger, and they became to have audiences of men and women. And some of the men and women may have come to make fun of them, but whatever the reason, some came to support them, some came because they were curious, some came for entertainment, but whatever the reasons were, she attracted larger and larger audiences. And that upset many people, many conservatives who certainly did not want to rock the boat when it came to slavery. And it also upset many who did not want to rock the boat when it came to the clear, separate sphere that was supposed to keep women in the home. And the congregational ministers of Massachusetts, who were very powerful in that era in 1837, actually wrote a letter that they asked every congregational minister to read from their pulpits one Sunday that summer. And the letter said in part that when a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural and the way is opened for degeneracy and ruin. On the theory that a picture is often worth 1,000 words, by degeneracy and ruin, they meant something like this, that the world as they knew it would be turned upside down. And here, of course, you see a woman in traveling clothes getting into a coach driven by a woman. Her husband is sitting at home doing the sewing and tending to the baby in the carriage. And even a male servant has been affected because rather than doing outdoor sorts of labor, he is doing the washing. So this was the fear that if women moved into the public sphere in any fashion, that life as men knew it would be turned upside down. The congregational ministers, of course, expected the Grimke sisters to leave the podium and sit down. I'm sure you know what happened next. They did no such thing. They continued to stand behind the podium, but they also picked up their pens. And they wrote a series of public letters that were published in the anti-slavery press. The letters are wonderful. You can find them online. I highly recommend them. But I'm just going to read you a couple of quick quotations that give you a sense of the flavor of what Angelina and Sarah were writing back in 1837. Sarah, for her part, wrote, "There are few things which present greater obstacles to the improvement and elevation of woman to her appropriate sphere, not the domestic sphere, but her appropriate sphere, than laws that she's had no voice in establishing." And Angelina, for her part, wrote, "I contend that woman has just as much right to sit in conventions, conferences, associations, and assemblies as man, just as much right to sit in the presidential chair of the United States." Now, after the Grimke sisters' tour, a number of other women joined them in speaking out, both against slavery and also to defend the right of a woman to do so. I wish I had time to cover all of them tonight. My book includes a number of others, but I'm going to focus for the moment on one of the very important women who came after Angelina and Sarah Grimke, and that is Lucy Stone, because Lucy Stone would become a leader of the suffrage movement. Lucy Stone was born in Worcester County, Massachusetts, a farm girl. She desperately did not want, in her late teenage years, to marry and start a family. So she did one of the few other things that were available to literate farm girls of her era. She became a school teacher. But she desperately wanted to continue her education. And by working for a number of years and saving money, finally, at age 25, she was able to travel to Ohio, where she enrolled in Oberlin College. And if any of you are familiar with Oberlin College, you know that it was started itself as a radical experiment, and it included in its student body African-American students and women. So Lucy Stone attended Oberlin College, and while she was there, she had the chance to hear from a number of prominent anti-slavery speakers, including Abby Kelly Foster of Massachusetts, Frederick Douglass, who had self-emancipated himself and now arrived on the scene, William Lloyd Garrison, and many others. And when she graduated, she was hired by William Lloyd Garrison to become a lecturer in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And she did that, but she also carved out a separate niche for herself because she also began to deliver lectures on the subject of women's rights. She folded them into her anti-slavery lectures, but she also insisted that some of the time she was going to give separate talks on the subject of women's rights and the inequalities that face women. So she did that. I'm breaking up tonight's talk into several sections so we can think about some of the lessons that may be relevant to today as we think about change, how change has been made in the past, the present, and in the future. And some of the lessons from the early years of the women's suffrage movement are the importance of speaking truth to power, the importance of challenging the injustices of the status quo, not accepting things the way they have always been, just because that's how they've been. And of course, a theme throughout, the importance of persisting. Change does not come easily. And I will just say on the subject of change, the women's suffrage movement, I don't remember when I first started thinking about it, long before I was going to write this book, but just sort of growing up, taking US history, and thinking about how long it took and how it was nearly 100 years, I'm not sure I had ever fully grasped how difficult it was to try to make a political change when you have no political rights. I mean, these women had to ultimately persuade men who had all the political power to broaden the political process to include them in it. I'm now going to turn to the next topic, which is going to be discussing my theory, accepted by many others, that the organized women's suffrage movement was launched in Worcester in 1850, not in Seneca Falls in 1848. And let me explain. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was a very important convention. It was the first time ever that women came together. It was a 2-day conference to discuss the subject of women's rights. It was, however, a very local conference. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had moved to Seneca Falls, knew Lucretia Mott from attendance at an anti-slavery convention. Lucretia Mott, who was an abolitionist in Philadelphia, had a sister in Seneca Falls. And in July 1848, Lucretia Mott came to visit her sister, and a tea was held with 5 women, including Lucretia Mott, Mott's sister, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and 2 other women. And as they talked about the new spirit abroad in the land. They talked about Lucy Stone's talks. They talked about the Grimke sisters. Abby Kelly Foster had delivered several lectures in Seneca Falls. And they decided that the time was ripe to see if they could call together a convention to discuss the topic of women's rights. And they did so. They planned this convention for only about 2 weeks later. It was advertised only in the local press. It was very successful. Several hundred people attended, men and women, mostly women, but also some African Americans, including Frederick Douglass. And they attended this conference held in Seneca Falls in this Wesleyan chapel. The congregation was led by abolitionists. And prior to the convention, as many of you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton famously drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. Modeled on the Declaration of Independence, it set out many of the injustices that a society led by men had imposed on women, including the lack of the franchise, the lack of the ability to vote, and resolved to make a whole series of changes, including allowing women to join their professions, to have more access to college educations, and of course, the right of suffrage. So the Seneca Falls Convention was important. And after it, there were several other local conventions, another one held in New York, one held in Ohio, for example. The reason why the Seneca Falls Convention did not start a movement is that, to use a modern term, it was what you would call a one-off. In other words, people came, they got inspired, and then they went home. There was no follow-up. And this was very much actually on Elizabeth Cady Stanton's mind. And she wrote a letter to her friend a couple of months later saying, "Do you not think we ought to have an agent or lecturer lecture on the subject of women's rights?" And wondered whether Lucy Stone could be engaged for that purpose. That didn't come to happen, but I show you this for 2 reasons. One is to emphasize how well-known Lucy Stone had quickly become, even though she had only been lecturing a very brief period of time, and also to point out that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, too, they all understood that this was not yet a movement. But a couple of years after Seneca Falls, after that convention had taken place, as well as the other ones I mentioned, Lucy Stone and some of her allies in the anti-slavery movement and the young women's rights movement in Massachusetts, including Abby Kelly Foster and others, decided that the time was ripe to call what they called the first National Women's Rights Convention. Just its name was significant. They called it the first because they wanted there to be a second and a third and a fourth. They called it national because they invited women from other states to join them. Now, national at this point really means northern, because all of these women in the early women's rights movement were also anti-slavery activists. So there was really, they were not at all supported in the South, but a woman from, and some men from 11 states attended, over 1,000 people attended this convention held in Worcester in October of 1850. Why Worcester? It was, of course, the home county of Lucy Stone, but the real reason was that it was a reformist city, and it was a transportation crossroads, north, south, and east, west, a place that people could get to, a thriving manufacturing city. And this convention was held in 1850. And before it ended, a whole series of committees were formed to plan for the next convention in 1851. The people at the convention were largely white. The early women's suffrage movement, and a lot of this will continue throughout, were largely white, literate, middle-class women, but there were always some exceptions. And so, for example, the self-emancipated slave, former slave, Sojourner Truth, attended the Worcester Convention of 1850. After the Worcester Convention, the success that Lucy Stone had hoped for continued. And as you can see from this slide, there were conventions held throughout the 1850s, and each one was bigger and brought more press attention than the last. The press was busy ridiculing some of these conventions. It was such a threat to the notion of woman belonging only in the domestic sphere. And so, for example, the New York Herald called the first convention in Worcester in 1850 and I'm quoting, motley gathering of fanatical mongrels, fugitive slaves, and fugitive lunatics. But I think the theory at this point was that all publicity, even bad publicity, was publicity. So there were conventions held throughout this decade. Susan B. Anthony only appears on the scene in 1852 when she attends the Women's Rights Convention held in Syracuse, New York. Susan B. Anthony, you all may know, was born in Adams, Massachusetts, but then grew up in Rochester, New York. And when she attends the 1852 convention, she at this point is also a school teacher. She is so inspired by it that she decides to devote the rest of her life to the cause of women's rights. And during these convention years of the 1850s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and Susan B. Anthony emerged as the three leaders of this young movement. Stanton was busy raising 7 children in Seneca Falls and rarely could attend anything, but she was a wonderful writer and she wrote wonderful letters to each of these conventions. And Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone, along with many others, did much of the organizing legwork. One of the things that makes talking about something like suffrage challenging is that you always have to think about what else was going on in the country. And of course, the same decade of the 1850s that led to small but steady growth in what was still a very small women's rights movement was also, of course, the decade that brought this nation closer to civil war over the issue of slavery. And we're going to turn to that in a moment. What are some of the lessons from these conventions? The importance of organizing and educating, that you have to plan, you have to work, you have to organize, you have to educate. Things don't just happen. We will, a little bit later, when we talk about history, turn to why it is that everybody on this Zoom knows about Seneca Falls and that many of you may know nothing or very little about the Worcester Conventions. We will get there in a moment. The Civil War began, of course, in 1860. 1861. This is not going to be a talk about the Civil War. But of course, all of these women's rights activists supported the Civil War, supported the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, were eager to see slavery end. And as a result, when war began in 1861, they intentionally put the women's rights movement on hold to support the Union Army in whatever way they could. So there was no further action specifically for women's rights of any significance during the years of the Civil War. But the work that women did during the Civil War would prove to be very important later on because they did tremendous organizing work related to the war. So some women, for example, served as nurses. Many women organized societies, sanitary societies and other societies to make and procure all sorts of provisions to send to soldiers in the field and in hospitals. And the organizational work and these societies that women formed coming together to sew and to knit and to gather provisions would form associations that would continue and really the genesis of women's clubs after the Civil War. And so one of the very important points of this is that during the Civil War, many women left their home. They weren't home all day long because they got together with other women doing work on behalf of the Union Army. Also, many women took over running homes and farms and businesses while their husbands, fathers, brothers, sons were away fighting and developed also many new skills. Wartime has also, in this country's history, as you probably all know, advanced women's rights, whether we're talking about World War I or World War II, or the Civil War. When the Civil War ended in 1865, there was a big focus on the ballot. The women's rights movement up until this point had focused, as I mentioned when I talked about the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, on a whole variety of rights for women, one of which, a very important one, was the right to vote. But after the Civil War, the importance of the vote took central stage. And that's because in discussion of amendments after the Civil War, the issue of voting took center stage. I'm sure you all know that the 13th Amendment eradicated slavery. The 14th Amendment established certain equalities or allegedly gave equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment would be directed toward voting. And as discussions in Congress that was still for this brief window of time after the Civil War, led by Republican abolitionists, they began to discuss who would they like to enfranchise after the Civil War. Stanton, Anthony, Stone, and their allies very much, of course, wanted to enfranchise African-American men, the formerly enslaved, as well as free Blacks in states where they had not been allowed to vote. But they also very much wanted women to be included. They wanted, as this petition says, universal suffrage, suffrage for all. And they hoped that there would be a new amendment added to the Constitution that would grant suffrage for all adults within the country. And a whole series of petitions like this were written. There were many advocates for universal suffrage, whites as well as Blacks. A very important Black woman who becomes very much active soon after the Civil War is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And I just want to mention her in particular because it was the Black woman involved in the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement who, even though, as we'll talk about, they were often marginalized, they often spoke of, to use a modern term, intersectionality. In other words, connecting the discrimination they felt on gender and the discrimination they felt regarding race. The white woman in the movement preferred to keep the focus solely on gender. The hoped for movement in Congress towards universal suffrage did not happen. Congress instead decided to move ahead with what would become the 15th Amendment, an amendment that would enfranchise all men, regardless of race, but would leave women entirely out. Now, why did Congress do that? Probably there were 4 different reasons at least. One is, as I'm sure you all know, that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln ultimately allowed African-American men to join the Union Army and vote for the Union. And there has long been this historical association between bullets and ballots. If you're willing to be shot at, you should move to the front of the line when ballots are being handed out. The Republicans in Congress were also confident of how Black men would vote. They knew that if they were enfranchised, they were going to support the party of Abraham Lincoln. But women, it was less clear. What would they do? Would they vote just the way their husbands voted, their fathers voted, and not necessarily support the Republican Party? Many of these former abolitionists were concerned that they couldn't advance 2 radical agenda items at the same time. In other words, suffrage for Black men and suffrage for women. And then, of course, not all former abolitionists favored women's suffrage. So Congress made the decision to pursue only suffrage for Black men, for all men, and to leave women behind. And that led to a very bitter, lasting dispute that pitted Lucy Stone on the one hand and Stanton and Anthony on the other. Because Stanton and Anthony condemned the 15th Amendment in terms that really are extraordinarily racist. Stanton said, for example, "I will not support men of other races making laws for the daughters," and of course she means the white daughters, "of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams." She accused politicians of degrading white women below unwashed and unlettered ditch diggers, bootblacks, butchers, and barbers. Anthony, for her part, said, if intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence, let the question of woman be brought up first and that of the Negro last. Lucy Stone took a very different position. She said, woman has an ocean of wrongs too deep for any plummet, and the Negro too has an ocean of wrongs that cannot be fathomed. I will be thankful in my soul if anybody can get out of the terrible pit. So in other words, Lucy Stone was very unhappy that women were left out, but she nevertheless pledged to support the 15th Amendment because she wanted any group that could to get out of the terrible pit of disenfranchisement. The 15th Amendment was, of course, as you all know, adopted to the United States Constitution. And on the heels of this debate and dispute over the 15th Amendment, a schism occurred in the young women's rights movement that led them to form two competing organizations. And for the next 20 years, Lucy Stone would lead one organization and Anthony and Stanton would lead a competing organization. Anthony and Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association based in New York. Their goal was to get a companion amendment to the 15th Amendment, a new amendment that would grant women the right to vote. They started a newspaper called The Revolution, but it ran out of money after only 2 years. Lucy Stone started the American Woman Suffrage Association, which was based here in Boston in offices right on Park Street. She said she adopted the strategy that would turn out to ultimately be the winning strategy. She said, I want a federal amendment too. We all want that, but how are we going to get it? We can't just say to congressmen and senators, please vote for it. We have to do the hard legwork of amending state constitutions and franchising women in a critical number of states, having them help to elect congressmen and senators who are beholden to women voters. And only when we have that critical mass will we then be able to persuade Congress to propose and the states to ratify a women's suffrage amendment to the United States Constitution. She recognized that it would be labor-intensive, long, hard work. And she was absolutely right. That was the strategy that prevailed, and it was indeed labor-intensive, long, and hard. But the only way that women's suffrage ultimately succeeded was by the arduous work of these state-by-state campaigns, as we'll talk about. She also began a newspaper called the Woman's Journal that was published every single week in Massachusetts on Park Street to support women's suffrage and also the advancement of women in all other spheres. She was also inclusive and welcomed women and Blacks to join her in the American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, why is it, now I'm going to turn back to why it is that we know so much more about Seneca Falls and Anthony and Stanton. And that's because one of the things that is so important whenever you think about history is to always think about who is writing the history. What is their purpose? What is their goal? And during these 20 years of schism, undoubtedly, the most significant thing that Anthony and Stanton did, they also campaigned for women's suffrage, testified before Congress, gave lots of talks. I mean, they worked hard on behalf of women's suffrage. But perhaps the most noteworthy thing they did is they were very mindful of the importance of writing their own version of history. And they wrote the first several volumes of what would become ultimately later on a 6-volume work called History of Women's Suffrage. And as they wrote this during these years of divide, they essentially wrote Lucy Stone and her allies out of the history, and they elevated their own role. And this is when Seneca Falls was ordained as the birthplace of the movement, because of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there at Seneca Falls. Neither Stanton nor Anthony were present or had any real role at the Worcester Convention. And so that's just a very important thing. Now, Lucy Stone, for her part, recognized what they were doing and objected to it. And in the pages of the Woman's Journal, she condemned what they were doing. She said, it's too early to write a history of the suffrage movement. First, we need to get suffrage. And she said, that your wing is not fit to write a history of this movement. But she was so busy working and publishing her newspaper that what she didn't do was pick up the pen and write a competing, different version of the history. And ultimately, now many historians, of course, recognize the full story much more clearly. But when women's history scholars in the 1960s and 1970s, as women's history was first really becoming and recognized academic field, one of the major sources they went to learn about the women's suffrage movement was these very authoritative looking volumes called History of Women's Suffrage by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So some of the lessons of this is the importance of always being willing to write history, pick up the pen, think about biases, and the willingness to question dominant narratives. I'm now going to turn briefly, and we're going to stop soon, so I'm just going to tell you a few more little tidbits. There's so much to this movement. The years after the Civil War stopped being a reformist era in this country. It's the era we know as the Gilded Age. The Republican Party, rather than being focused on reforms, a lot of its leaders were focused on making fortunes. A conservative era when people who worked on behalf of women's rights, suffragists, were ridiculed in cartoons like this, which is very similar to the one I showed you earlier, slightly more modern clothing. The United States Supreme Court, which has been a conservative institution during most of this country's history, as it is today, reminded everybody in 1873 that it's the domestic sphere that properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. So it was a very difficult time to be working for women's rights. But nevertheless, the activists persevered. The American Woman Suffrage Association was housed in the same office on Park Street as the Woman's Journal, and also the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Association, which was led by Julia Ward Howe, who of course had become very well known after she crafted the lyrics to Battle Hymn of the Republic during the Civil War. This is what the Woman's Journal looked like. Again, the movement was largely led by white literate women, but there always were African-American women working sometimes with white allies and often separately on parallel tracks. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was a leading Black activist in Massachusetts of that era. And she herself wrote her own, formed a newspaper called The Woman's Era, dedicated to the advancement of African-American women. And Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was warmly welcomed into the Massachusetts Woman Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association because Lucy Stone, as I mentioned earlier, welcomed African-Americans and men into her organization. During these years, a very important note that many people don't realize is that these organizers campaigned in the East Coast, but also in new Western states. They sent people out to Western states to campaign for women's suffrage in the hopes that as territories were formed into states, that new state constitutions would enfranchise women. And these new states where women worked alongside men on, wagon trains and clearing land and doing all these things, and they didn't have these historical conservative institutions, banks and universities and so forth, would be more amenable to women's suffrage. And that actually turned out to be the case, so that by the end of the 19th century, these 4 states listed here, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, had actually all enfranchised women. So this was the beginning of the success of the Lucy Stone strategy, which is we need to enfranchise women in states, have them be part of the voting electorate that will send people to Washington, and then we'll be able to make change. There was also what was called a partial suffrage strategy, trying to do things like enfranchise women to vote in limited elections, such as for school committee. In 1890, the 2 organizations were persuaded to merge by the next generation of suffragists, including Alice Stone Blackwell, Lucy Stone's daughter. The feeling was that these 3 women were now very elderly, and that the younger generation had no patience for 2 organizations that had begun because of a dispute that was now decades old. Lucy Stone would die soon thereafter in 1893. Stanton never really cared that much for nitty-gritty organizational work, and she went off to England for quite a while to live with one of her daughters. And it was Susan B. Anthony who would take the helm and lead the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is another reason for Susan B. Anthony's enduring fame. Some of the lessons of challenging eras, which are relevant to our own time: the importance of tailoring strategies as necessary, of being resourceful, creative, persisting, and having confidence that no matter how long and arduous the struggle, that justice will ultimately prevail. I don't want to talk too much longer, so what I'm going to do now is just tell you a very little bit about the 20th century. The 20th century, so these organizations merged in 1890. We come to another era in American history. The Gilded Age is left behind, and the Progressive Era, an era of reform. And even though the Progressive Era included nativism, xenophobia, and racism, it also included ultimately prevailing public opinion that certain things in our society had to be addressed: crowded cities, unsafe factories, unsafe food and water, child labor, and so forth. And as you can imagine, a reformist era would be more friendly to women's rights than past eras. So without going into the story, because I want to wrap this up in the next 3 minutes, I just want to introduce to you what a new generation of women. It really took 3 generations to get women's suffrage. So we now have new women who have some of the advantages of the late 19th century. More women had gone to college. There were certain new jobs available to women, things like being telephone operators and secretaries. So more women were working out of the home in different capacities. And I'm not going to go through all these new leaders, but Maud Wood Park, I will just stop on for a moment. She's one of my favorites, and she would, in 1920, become the first national president of the League of Women Voters after women's suffrage. Maud Wood Park desperately wanted to involve this cadre of educated young women in the women's suffrage movement, and she founded what was called the College Equal Suffrage League in Massachusetts. Florence Luscombe, who had gone to MIT, walked around selling the Woman's Journal and organized parades for suffrage. And the idea was to popularize suffrage, to make it seem fashionable, to make it seem that young women would care about, and that hopefully they would be able to persuade others. So they had parades like this. And this one is obviously led by college women. You can see the signs for Wellesley, Radcliffe, Swarthmore. And I'm going to stop here because this will set the stage for the success that will ultimately come. And I talked to you a little bit, you saw some of the cartoons about the press ridicule. And for years, suffragists had been portrayed as manly, unattractive spinsters. You know, who would want to be a supporter of women's suffrage? But people like Maud Wood Park and Florence Luscombe and many others, one of the things that they did was work to change the image of the movement, to make it fashionable, to make it vibrant. This is a cartoon by a man named Boardman Robinson, captioned, "The type has changed," showing the suffragist on the left has changed into somebody like the suffragist on the right. And the last thing I want to say is that the women's suffrage movement over these next decades until we get to 1920 would continue to be a story largely of the women's suffrage movement led by literate white middle-class women, sometimes upper-class women, but eventually and gradually, and I'm happy to talk more about this during the Q&A, the women's suffrage movement would come to include more working-class women, although largely still white. And some suffragists welcomed African-American women into this newly constituted National American Woman Suffrage Association, but Black women were largely working on parallel tracks apart because the suffragists did not embrace any intersectionality between race and gender. They were focused on suffrage. That was for a number of different reasons, of course. one of which was a focus on, they viewed gender and race as entirely different buckets. And some of it was also practical, because the women's suffrage movement knew that ultimately, to get a national amendment, they were going to have the support of at least some Southerners in this country. And the way in which they went about it was to really say very little, if anything, about the rights of Black women, understanding that the same Jim Crow laws that had been passed in the South after the Civil War to strip the voting rights away from Black men, that similar laws would undoubtedly be used to deny African-American women the vote. So just to jump to the very end, because unfortunately there's not time for all of this today. Ultimately, in 1920, of course, the 19th Amendment was adopted and added to the United States Constitution. The League of Women Voters replaces the National American Woman Suffrage Association, with Maud Wood Park as the first president. And then, very importantly, just to conclude in terms of also setting this up for Q&A, the women's suffrage movement of 1920 was an enormous victory for women. But it's really a semicolon, not a period. In other words, it wasn't the end of the story. Black women who were no sooner enfranchised, as I mentioned, than they were disenfranchised in the South. Native Americans, in many states, largely did not yet have the right to vote. That wouldn't come until 1924. Asian Americans, many Asian American immigrants were not allowed to naturalize and become citizens until during and after World War II. The Latinx community faced discrimination when it came to voting for a variety of reasons, including up until really the 1960s, the failure of ballots to appear in more than one language. And of course, I don't think I need to remind anybody here today that the struggle for voting rights continues very much as we sit here today in March of 2024. So I am going to stop for the moment and open this up for questions about anything that I had a chance to cover, as well as all the many things that in a limited time I did not have a chance to cover. And thank you very much for attending and listening.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was really fascinating. We have the first question is from Nikki. Barbara, I read your suffrage book a few years ago, and I think you explained why you use woman instead of women, but I can't recall. Can you explain?
Yes, and I actually now am using woman's more than I used to. I used woman when I started researching and writing this book because that is what the participants called it. They referred to their movement as the Woman Suffrage Movement, singular. And all their writings, that's how they always referred to it. And so I decided to do the same thing. As time has gone on over these last few years, and of course the anniversary of 1920 was marred by COVID, more and more authors and historians have decided to embrace the more commonly used modern terminology of women's suffrage, WOMEN''S, and I now find that I use both interchangeably. But I had made a specific concerted choice years ago when I started researching the book to rely on woman.
Thank you. I was struck by the relationship between traditional concepts of family, now even as it regards women's rights, and still then, and how this kind of cycle continues to recur.
Yes, I mean, the notion that women belong at home has always had a lot of followers among both men and among women. One thing I didn't get to talk about tonight is that as women's suffrage became more likely to perhaps succeed, so we're talking about the very end of the 1800s and the early years of the 20th century, there were women-led anti-suffrage movements founded because they were so opposed to expansion of their own rights to include suffrage on the grounds that women who voted would neglect their home and their children, that women were privileged by being placed on a pedestal where they didn't have to do things like deal with the dirtiness of politics, and that change was bad. Now, of course, many of these women were also women who occupied positions of privilege. Many of them were married to wealthy men, the leaders. But I mean, those same attitudes, if you think to Phyllis Schlafly opposing the Equal Rights Amendment, and many others, the notion that women belong primarily at home, are in charge of the family, continues to be an important undercurrent. I mean, there is no question, it's not as if all women support women's rights, and it's just that some men don't. Women themselves have always been and remain divided today, as we all know. I mean, one of the amazing things about living through our current political climate is that we are seeing so many of the same debates that took place all those years ago taking place again today about slightly different things.
Cleo says, thank you for sharing. Do you have theories as to why Americans did not implement militant methods to the same extent as the women in the UK?
That's a great question. So one of the things I did not get to talk about tonight was Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party. As the suffrage movement continued into the 20th century, and really beyond 1910, so the last decade, more and more progress was being made, but it wasn't fast enough for a number of some of the youngest, most active-oriented women in the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And in particular, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who had previously traveled to England and been involved in a militant women's suffrage movement there, came back to the US and wanted to apply some of the same tactics. And they formed an organization called the National Woman's Party. It's very small, but in the public eye a lot. And they were the ones, many of you probably are familiar with them, who picketed in front of the White House when Wilson was president. They were arrested for doing so, and if sentenced, many of them went on hunger strikes and so forth. So they were very vehemently public, picketing and so forth, but they did not engage in the militant methods of some of the most militant suffragists in England, which included things like planting bombs in mailboxes and banks and government buildings. And I think the reason is that Alice Paul ran the National Woman's Party from the top. I mean, it was not a bottoms-up organization. And she felt that those sorts of methods were really going to backfire in the United States, which was already very much on edge due to anarchist bombings and other things that were going on, the labor struggle, and so forth. And so she thought that this method of being in the public eye as silent sentinels picketing, if there was sufficient newspaper coverage and so forth, maybe could accomplish some of those same ends. And then, of course, the arrests were really welcomed. I mean, hunger strikes were a terrible thing to endure, and forced feeding, but it brought tremendous public attention and public sympathy to the cause. Another difference was that in England, with its parliamentary system, you didn't have, the suffrage was either going to be granted nationally or not. While in the United States, where we have 50 states, and each one having its own state constitution, there really was, even if it was very slow, there really was constant momentum forward. And I think that helped suffragists in this country feel that even if the glacier was moving slowly, that it was always moving in the right direction and steady. So I think those are some of the reasons.
Jesus, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about any connections between other social movements and the women's movement, particularly as immigration was building in this country, and you had massive floods of people moving here. And I'm thinking about the troubles and injustices that folks were enduring who were immigrating to this country, and whether the women's movement sought to, bring them into the fold and fight for more.
That's a great question. I think the answer is yes, but not everybody. So the thing about the women's suffrage movement, I mean, in order for it to win ultimately, I mean, to get the men of this country to share power with women, as I said, took decades and decades and countless state campaigns, because almost every state that ultimately enfranchised women efforts first failed and then ultimately succeeded. I mean, as late as 1915, when a final attempt was made to amend the Massachusetts state constitution to add women's suffrage, it failed. So it was a very long, hard struggle. Many of the suffragists, including the leaders, embraced suffrage and said, you know, you can disagree on other issues, you can work on them or not work on them. We are about voting. But many of the activists did embrace these other causes. And so a lot of suffragists worked very hard on behalf of labor unions. Labor union leaders joined the women's suffrage movement, understanding that if women could vote, they might support expanding rights to workers. So there were definitely alliances, including alliances that supported immigrants in all sorts of ways. But by no means did that include everybody in the movement. It was a disparate movement that brought together women of all different, with all different political persuasions, on behalf of the goal of gaining women the right to vote, which is part of why, I mean, after women's suffrage, it wasn't until I think it was 1980, that it first became clear that the woman's vote in this country tilts toward the modern Democratic Party, which of course is different from the Democratic Party of, you know, decades earlier, because women's voting results, to the extent it was tracked, were not different from men of the state or city or town where they lived for the most part. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm happy to have you
No, that does. Thank
follow
you.
up. Okay.
We have a question from Sarah. Thank you for such an engaging talk. Outside of your own book, of course, do you have any other recommended reading on the topic?
There are so many books because, you know, I actually was a little bit in front of some of the deluge of books that were published really at the anniversary. So there one book, one of my favorite books is by a historian named Susan Ware, who wrote a book about a lot of sort of unheralded suffragists of all different backgrounds that I really love because it gives such a sense of the diversity of kinds of people that were involved in the movement. She talks about farmer suffragists and so many others, explorer suffragists. I mean, it's a wonderful book. Martha Jones wrote a book that focuses on African-American women in the women's suffrage movement. And there are many others. Those would be two of my top reads, I guess, if I had to come up with just a couple.
Thank you. I think questions are slowing down. So I want to thank you very much for being with us tonight, Barbara, and for sharing your expertise on this topic. I learned a lot, and I imagine everyone else did too. So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your support of our programming, and we look forward to seeing you at our next speaker series. Bye. Good
Thank
night,
you all
everybody.
so much. Good night.